Good morning and welcome to today's ELGL webinar about local government strategic planning with Kevin Knutson and Invisio. I am Kirsten Wyatt, the ELGL Executive Director, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's presentation. ELGL is the Engaging Local Government Leaders Network, and we engage the brightest minds in local government. One of the ways we do this is to provide exceptional and free online training about local government innovations. This webinar is free for ELGL members, and if you've logged on and you're not yet a member, you can sign up at elgl.org/membership. Memberships are $30 a person and enable us to provide awesome content like today's session. We'll also save a recording of today's webinar in the ELGL webinar library located in the members-only section of elgl.org. Today, we're excited to introduce ELGL to Kevin Knutson. Kevin is going to talk to us about topics and trends related to local government strategic planning. Before we begin, I want to let you know that your microphones and conference phones are muted, and this makes the webinar enjoyable and efficient for everyone. After the presentation is finished, we will open up for your questions, and these may be submitted using the chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. I will ask these questions as they come in, so the recording of the webinar also includes the questions to our guests. Today's webinar is part of ELGL's new Jam of the Month series, where we take our formidable content, online, and social media outreach on a deep dive into a particular topic area. And so this month, we're exploring the concepts related to strategic planning, the ways that local governments around the world are using performance management to improve their organizations. Today, Kevin will share his perspectives on these topics and how Invisio is partnering with local government organizations. We will be live tweeting today's webinar, and you can follow along with the hashtag ELGLJam, and be sure to use the Twitter handle for today's topic, @InvisioINC. But before we get started, I have two lightning round questions for Kevin. And the first one is, what is your most controversial non-political opinion?
Well, I think it currently is that Jerry Lewis was the funniest man to ever live. Whenever I mention it, I get various feedback on that one.
Well, so you just moved to Canada. Do you think you should have moved to France instead?
Well, I would have been much more in the majority there, wouldn't I?
You would have. And what book are you currently reading, and would you recommend it?
So I'm just finishing up one of Tom Robbins' earlier novels, Another Roadside Attraction. And I had read all of his later novels and loved it, but I had never gotten to his earlier stuff, and it's really incredible. I would highly recommend it to anyone who wants to, see the world a little bit differently.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to hand over the webinar to you, and let's get us started. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. So I thought it might be a good idea to introduce myself a little bit, let you know who I am and why I'm here talking to you about this today. I started my career in local government with the city of Coral Springs, Florida back in 1991. I had the good fortune early on of getting into the budget office and became the city's first budget and strategic planning manager during a period of time when we were creating the first strategic plan that we had. And I cast about the country looking for models that we could use. And really, at that time, there was very little strategic planning of any type going on in local government. And what was there was basically very early on things, goal setting and alignment and those kinds of things. So what I did is I looked at corporate strategic planning and said, well, what lessons are there for local government? What can we learn from them? Two of the ones that I looked at the most closely were the local electric utility, Florida Power and Light, because they were in quality programs. They had won awards for their planning and were considered one of the best in the area. Plus, I had recently worked for IBM at that time and was familiar with their process. So I took those and pulled them together and cobbled something with staff that really was just the very beginning of aligning our efforts with outcomes. And we learned a lot over the ensuing 15 or 16 years that I worked on that. And ultimately, the city was the first city to win the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. And one of the things in our feedback that they really focused on was how our strategic planning really set us up for success. And so since that time, I've worked for the city of Reno. I've worked with Management Partners, a local government consulting firm, and done dozens and dozens of strategic plans across the country. And just this month, I joined Invisio, which is a software company based in Vancouver, Canada, hence Kirsten's question earlier. And just moved here and very excited to get started because it's one of the better software platforms to support local governments in doing strategic planning and performance management and reporting. So what I'd like to do is talk to you for a few minutes about why we do strategic planning, what it is, what the elements are, how you can do it successfully, you know, the nuts and bolts of it. Then I'll spend a few minutes talking about how we support that, and then I'd be glad to take any questions or answers. So you don't have to stare at me and this map on the wall. I'm going to use a presentation for most of the rest of the time. So let me pull that up real quick. It'll just take a second, and we'll get started. So one of the reasons that strategic planning is coming to the forefront right now is because across the country, we're dealing with the issue of trust in local government. More and more people are starting to look at elected officials through a different lens. They're starting to wonder what their motives are, why they got into it in the first place, what they're doing with their tax money, how effective are they being in making policy and deploying it. And these are valid questions. And it's incumbent on us to figure out a way to communicate back to those folks to help them understand how we're doing it. Now, trust in local government is still much higher than in the other realms, but it's still an open question for people as to whether we can be trusted. Building trust is actually pretty simple. You know, my dad taught me when I was growing up, you know, say what you're going to do and do what you say, and that really is the foundation of it. It can be improved by developing a shared vision, so you're all working towards the same thing so that you all agree on what the outcomes are supposed to be. But really it's that following through on commitments, being transparent about what you're doing, and holding yourself accountable for getting the things done that you said you would do. They teach you in crisis communications, when something goes terribly, terribly wrong, the first thing you do is admit what went wrong, what your role in it was, and then talk to people about what you're going to do to make it better. And that's a trust-building exercise as well. When, you know, because things don't always go well, and you need to be able to shift and take responsibility and make things right. So all of these things share something in common, and that is an understanding of where the organization needs to go and what you're going to do to get there. And that's where strategic planning comes in. Now, there can be all different kinds of strategic planning, and my little timeline here kind of got thrown off when I transitioned into Microsoft Office, so sorry about that. But I see this as a continuum where on one end you've got goal setting, which is really just sitting around a room and saying, hey, what do we want to get done this year? What are the things that we want to accomplish? How are we going to end this year and know that we did what we set out to do? That can be done by staff, that can be done with your elected body, that can be done with community members, but it's a very simple, here's our 5 things that we're going to get done this year. A little bit more complex is getting into the strategic planning, where you actually have a plan that you publish that has many different elements to it, which I'll describe later. But it's a more organizational approach, it's a more complete approach, and it includes things that help you define success for those goals. So you're not just saying, hey, that's our goal, but you're also kind of putting measures in place that allow you to actually determine whether or not you did what you said you were going to do. And then the far more complex version is community visioning, where you go out and engage the community in the conversation about that direction and where you ought to go, and then roll that into a strategic planning process. And like I said, it's much more robust. What most cities do is that kind of middle of the road thing. They assume that through the data that they've gathered and the fact that their elected officials are in contact with their constituents and through all the feedback that they get on a regular basis, that they have a pretty good handle on what the vision for the organization ought to be. And so today we're really going to focus in on that strategic planning portion and talk about that the most. Well, there's 4 key elements to this. The first is understanding the current situation. You can't really plan for the future if you don't know where you are. The environmental scan is the key component of that. And during that period of time and in that document, you look at different trends. You know, financially, are taxes going up and down? How's the economy? Are the demographics changing in our community? Are people coming? Are people leaving? What development do we have coming on board? What does that mean to our tax base? You know, all these different trends and things that you can look at to determine where in the future you think your revenues are going to come from and your service delivery needs are going to come from. You also look at resources and complaints. What do you have in terms of staffing, time, equipment, money, all those different things, and what is the total universe of things that you have to work with in order to get things done. The other part of that, and this is where the big visioning, community visioning projects come in, but you can do it in a much smaller way in strategic planning, is understanding community needs and wants. What is it that the people who live in your community want to see? What do they need? What are the bare minimum service levels you need to attain? What's a good level of service and what's a great level of service? You kind of understand the range of what it is that you're trying to accomplish and what you could be doing. What technology impacts are you going to have? What's changing where you need to adapt? Where do you need to make investments? And then lastly, how is state or federal legislation going to impact you? And a lot of times this comes out in the form of unfunded mandates, but it also can come in the form of changes to the tax code or other decisions that they make that have an impact on your ability to provide service. The plan itself is built on that context. And usually most cities will have a mission statement, which is basically a statement of why they exist, what they're there to do, sometimes how they're going to do it. Often other cities will have a vision statement, which is a statement of where they want to be in 25, 50, 100 years. Who is it they're trying to become, and what at the end of the day would be a successful outcome for the community. Sometimes they have both because they're mutually exclusive ideas that can work together to help meet either one. So your mission can help you achieve the vision that you're trying to attain, and a vision can help articulate why the mission exists. Often they'll select values, things that guide behavior on a day-to-day basis, like transparency or responsibility or openness or any number of things. As many different cities there's different approaches to that. And it really boils down to what that community feels is important. I'm seeing more and more cities including diversity as a value that they want to make decisions by and include in their day-to-day activities. And that's a change from when I was doing this 20 years ago when that wasn't as important. So the values have a way of changing over time and incorporating new ideas and things that are important that maybe we didn't recognize before. Now, the bedrock of any strategic plan, so a lot of these are optional items, but the bedrock is to have some goals. We often call these priorities, and they're very high level, very abstract. They can be so abstract that public safety could be a priority, or financial stability, or something that sounds good, but you really don't know what it means. And that's okay because they become buckets for you to fill with all the other ideas that you're going to do to get there. And those things are the strategies. So when you have a priority of public safety, your strategies could be things like, we're going to decrease the crime rate by 5%. We're going to decrease response time in the fire department by 15%. We're going to change our residents' opinion of how safe they feel in the parks by increasing the number of patrols we have. These are the things that you specifically want to do in that priority area, and they're much more definable. They're much more measurable. They're much more something that you can say, this is what success looks like. So if public safety is a priority for us, how do we know we've done that at the end of the day? And these strategies provide those explanations, those definitions. In one city I worked for, we called them directional statements. What direction are we headed in this area? And then for each one of those, you're going to do specific things. They're action items. And in implementation, there could be projects, there could be programs, initiatives. It could be the same thing you're already doing, just changed a little bit to adapt to technology or to changing community needs. But really, these are the boots on the ground, frontline things that you're going to do to make things happen. And to support all of this, you need a couple of different measures and indicators. The most critical one is some sort of timeline. When are you going to do these things? When are you going to start doing it? And when are you going to be finished and have some sort of result that you can show? Many programs that you do don't have an end to them, but you need to kind of put an artificial timeline on it so that you can step back at that time and see if you did what it was you intended to do, even though it will go on in the future. And this becomes important later for reporting and tracking purposes so that you can let people know, are you on progress to do what you said you were going to do? If you have no end date to something, then there's no way you can ever say, this is the percent of the project that we've gotten done. The other type of indicator are the outcome measures. What was it that you wanted to have happen? If you are going to make a change to a policy, and the idea is that it will reduce the amount of people who need medical care for certain things, then you can measure how many people are getting medical care for that thing today. And then the measure at the end of it should show that your behavior had an impact on that measurement and that it's gone down. And that way you know for certain that you've had the impact that you intended to have, and you can report out to people and let them know that you succeeded in doing that. The other purpose is not only the outcomes, but you can have process measures to determine if you're on the right track to get those things done. Are you headed in the right direction? So performance measures become a very important part of strategic planning. You'll see a lot of places who are new to strategic planning really miss that element of it. And really what they have then is a wish list. Here's what we want to do, rather than a plan to actually get it done. These measures give you that focus and the ability to talk to people about what it is you're actually accomplishing. So once you have the strategic plan, then you implement it. And all those projects, programs, and initiatives I talked about come to life. You make the investments, you figure out how you're going to get those things done, and you're off and running and you do it. Well, along the way, you want to report back on a regular basis. We often recommend to clients that they report back to the board on at least a quarterly basis at a council meeting or something like that, and that they make it available to the public on some sort of regular basis as well. Internally, while you're actually managing the process of implementation and executing your strategy, you want to make sure you're meeting on a weekly or monthly basis to review your measures and make sure you're on track. And that's where having internal dashboards and documents that you can use to actually track your progress become extremely important. So what strategy does for you is really two things. It allows you to engage your staff in a process of aligning your day-to-day work activity with your strategy, with the things that you want to accomplish. So all of these different pieces kind of roll down from the community needs through the elected officials making decisions about what those priorities and goals are, with the city manager leading the implementation charge. Departments take their pieces and do what they need to do. Often there's cross-functional task teams that get together to work on specific things. And then the teams that actually are doing the work out there in the field executing on those plans. At the same time, regular and consistent staff progress updates coming from those teams and departments and being reviewed at the management team level, shared with the council or commission, and then rolled out to the community help, number one, show that you're being accountable for what you said you would do, and allows a level of transparency, because a lot of times what you plan to do and what you hope the outcome will be don't come to fruition. And everybody's experienced that. And what you want to be able to do in those times is say, okay, that was our plan to address this problem. It's not working. We're off target. We're not going to make it. Here's what we're going to do to change our strategy, to change our approach, and to make another effort to get there. And that kind of transparency allows the criticism of the failures that we inevitably are going to face to transform into an opportunity to improve the way we approach things and to work collaboratively towards solving the problems rather than blaming people and looking for scapegoats. I can't stress strongly enough how being transparent about this process actually brings everybody into those different discussions in a way that allows for kind of a calm, rational discussion of the issues rather than angry finger pointing on Twitter and in the blogs. And so it's a complete cycle of information moving through the organization. It's policy being driven downward, it's strategy and ideas being deployed, and information about what's happening and your successes and your failures rolling back up. So at Invisio, we really believe that the core of this is the ability to communicate about what it is you want to do and how you're doing as you're going along. And so there's three major portions to our services. The first one is the plan manager, which allows you to look at all the different elements, align your activities and actions with it, link those performance measures in, and actually have an ongoing conversation within the organization to make that happen. The dashboards and the performance analytics portion of it allows you to take the information that's coming in, manipulate it, research it, determine what is actually happening and make decisions along the way. So you can use data to make better decisions, and then report out what your progress is to the appropriate people. There's a screen capture of a public dashboard as an example on my screen here, where anybody anywhere in the world can open that up and look and see what you intended to do, what your progress is so far, and what your measures are saying about your success. And so it's a wonderful way of getting people engaged in what you're trying to accomplish so that they know what you're trying to do, but also letting them know where you're at in the process of doing those things and what the output and outcome is going to be. Our basic workflow includes all those different elements. We load in all the different data sets and pieces of information that you need to make decisions with. We help you put your plan in there and organize it in a way that links the right people to the right pieces so they can report on it, gives the leaders and managers dashboards so they can check on a regular basis to see how things are going and make in-stream decisions. So if they see something that's not going the right way, they can fix it and get it on track before it's too late. There's nothing worse than getting to the end of something and realizing, wow, I could have done something different 6 months ago to fix this and I didn't even know it. You can publish reports and dashboards and all kinds of things to communicate and analyze the information that you have. And so that's basically how we support all that different kind of activity within the organization. We do a lot of work for local governments. That's our specialty. I told you a little bit about myself. I spent 27 years working in local government, and I'm Vice President of Customer Success, and my job here at Invisio is to work with you to help you get this done in a way that helps you be successful and implement your strategy. So with that, we're about halfway through. I really like to get questions and answer them. I think that's the best way that I can be of help, and so I'd like to open the floor to any questions. Thank you, Kirsten.
Wonderful, and thank you so much for that great presentation. I hope everyone can see Kevin's contact information is on the screen, and we'll also make that available in our recording about his presentation today and ways to stay in touch. I also want you to know that I was live tweeting some of your key quotes from the presentation using the hashtag ELGLJam. So for our listeners and watchers, you can follow along there as well and add your own key quotes to that lineup on Twitter. But I'll get things started by, sometimes with new software solutions, there can be some questions about how you actually get it off the ground or get started. And so if someone listened to this presentation today and they said, all of that aligns perfectly with what my organization is looking to do, what would be the next steps and how do you actually launch Invisio in a community?
So the first step that you ought to take is to actually design the process that you want to use and gain some buy-in into that so that the people who have to do the work are actually part of the process of designing that. There's nothing worse than saying, here's what we're going to do and here's what you have to do, and getting people to say, well, I don't understand that and I'm really not sure I want to do that. So sitting down and mapping out the process, saying, in April, we're going to start this research where we're going to look at our environment and determine where we're at today. Then we're going to have a workshop and we're going to get together and discuss, what we think the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. Look at all the research, and start to make some decisions about what direction we're heading. And then on this day, we're going to publish the plan, and on this day, we're going to implement it. Here's how it ties into the budget process. Here's how it drives decisions in resource allocation. Here's how we're going to report on it. It's basically building the system. You don't want to start it not knowing how it's going to work. And a lot of cities do that. They'll go and have a meeting, they'll have a workshop, something will come out of it, and they don't know what to do with those things because they haven't thought it through. They don't have a plan. And so constructing your process is critical. And there's a lot of great models out there that you can use. There's a bunch of cities who are doing it really well. I'll be happy to refer you to some different folks who might be relevant for your organization. But you can just go out there and do a Google search and find a ton of great ideas out there. From our perspective, really having a robust system is the key. Because for our software to really help you, you have to have all those elements that I talked about. You have to have some sort of goals. You have to have strategies. You have to have the actions. That is absolutely critical. And you need the timelines and measures to go in there because the key value that we provide is that communications piece internally where everybody's putting in where they're at with their projects and how it's going, and the ability to report out on that and provide dashboards so that people can update and look at them all the time. Without those elements, you really don't have the ability to do that, and you're missing a huge opportunity.
All right, so we have a question from one of our members. Eric wants to know, can you address some of the pitfalls between measures of performance versus measures of effectiveness?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that happens when people first start measuring, you ask your departments, hey, we need some performance metrics. Can you give them to us? What they want to give you is workload measures. What they want to give you are things that describe what they do. And that really is not useful in making any decisions about how effective what they do is or how efficient it is. Instead, what it does is it just provides a descriptive narrative. So an example of that is I'm the solid waste department, and we're going to pick up 35,000 garbage cans this year. Well, how much did it cost us per garbage can? There's an efficiency measure. And did we pick up all the garbage in a way that was satisfactory to the residents? That's an effectiveness measure. So you want to start looking at things in different ways, and efficiency and effectiveness are the two most important. How much money, time, and energy did you put into doing those things, and can you reduce that and make it cheaper and faster? And did you actually do what you set out to do? And effectiveness can be a tricky thing because it can be an outcome. Did you make the change that you expected? Were people satisfied, or did it meet the needs that were articulated? Or it can be even more abstract than that. A lot of times, like for financial indicators, an outcome would be, did we achieve the bond rating that we intended to achieve, or something like that? And that tells you how effective you are in doing these things because of all the sub-measures that are behind that kind of idea.
All right, and as a reminder to our listeners, if you use that chat bar over on the left side, you too can ask questions of Kevin, but we'll keep going with the questions that we have here. Okay. Two great questions from Rosalind. First one, we are in the process of trying to revamp our measures. Not too sure our departments have a clue what the measures should be. How do I guide them to establishing meaningful, measurable measures?
So one of the things I used to do as a budget director is I would hold a workshop with the people in the departments who were responsible for developing these things. And I would do a brief presentation on what good measurement looked like and how you can make decisions with measures. What information do you need that would actually change your mind on something? And then I would ask them in that workshop to, either develop a new measure or use a measure they already had and write it down. And we would put it up on the board and we talk about it. So let's assume that it's going from 0 to 10 in that measure. What behavior change would that drive for you? Let's say it went to -10. Would that change your opinion? And more times than not, if they could not articulate what changes they would make based on what the measurement was doing, then it wasn't a good measure to be using, because you're just now you're just counting things or collecting data just to be collecting data. The whole goal of a performance management system is to make good decisions, is to take the data and let it inform you so that you can change the way things are happening for the better. And so engaging in that conversation, talking it through with their peers, workshopping those things really is powerful, especially since you just went through how to do measurement and what the different types of measures were with them. So they've got that new vocabulary to work with. The other thing that I would do is that after everybody would submit it, I would do a critique of the different departments, and I would score their measures based on how useful it was as a communication tool, how useful it was as a decision-making tool, whether or not it could become a key intended outcome or a key performance indicator in our strategic plan. Did it rise to that level of importance? And give them some feedback in that way as well. And basically what we would do is say, look, we don't want to have 30 performance measures from your department. We just want 3. We want 2 or 3 or 4 of the best ones, the one that really tell the story of your department, of how successful you were, what you accomplished, and how efficient you were.
And a follow-up question, how do you get, or what role should city management play in this process?
So I'm assuming the process we're talking about is strategic planning and performance measurement, so I'll talk about it that way. First of all, if people in the organization don't think the city manager or county administrator or whoever the chief executive is behind us, they're going to be less motivated to actually do the work that you're asking them to do. They're going to say, hey, I've got more important things to do. I've got to catch bad guys, put out fires, and pick up garbage, not sit around the office and make up numbers for you to play with. And it's a legitimate complaint because they are very busy. But the irony of that is if they would capture these measures, look at them, analyze them, and use them, they'd be a lot less busy. They'd be more efficient and effective with the use of their resources and could do a lot more. And so what you really need is that corporate sponsorship. You need some executive who's out there saying, here's our expectations for data collection. Here's our expectations for alignment with the strategic plan. And then there's follow through. And the best follow through is a weekly or monthly management team meeting where you actually put the dashboard up on the wall and say, how are we doing? Are we making the goals that we set out to do? Have you put your measures in? Am I looking at a measure that hasn't been updated in 6 months and I don't know what's going on? So now me as the city manager, and I was a city manager for a while and used this tool very effectively, I would say, I don't know if you're doing well or not because you're not sharing your accomplishments with me. You're not sharing your data with me. And that's not okay. Then it became an issue for performance management. And at that level, you really don't want to have those discussions with department directors and project managers, folks like that. You want them to respond and do what needs to be done. If you're the budget director asking for it, you're a lot less likely to get it. If you're the city manager, you're going to get it.
A follow-up question about the concept of a measure of efficiency. And our participant was just saying that that's a good point. Anything else you want to add on that concept of a measure of efficiency for our listeners to further consider?
Sure. Well, you can look at it a number of different ways. There's efficiency in time. Did we do it quickly enough? There's efficiency in use of resources, and that can be money or personnel. I think a lot of times the best use of efficiency measures is in benchmarking. And so when you look at how you're doing, that's really just a capture of the situation that you're in, and it doesn't have a value associated with it. You don't know if that's good, bad, or indifferent necessarily. What happens is you can go out and look at, well, what are other peer cities who have similar situations, similar services, similar needs? What are they accomplishing? And I'll give you an example from my own experience. We were responding to somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 false alarms due to home alarm systems being set off by animals or by accident with our fire department. It was costing us about $2 million a year in resources that could have been used better. And we went into the ICMA data and saw that Bellingham, Washington had a much better rate than we did. Now, you couldn't talk too far away cities. We're down in South Florida at the very southeastern tip, and they're all the way up in the northwest, two different communities, but the same problem. So I called up and said, hey, I don't understand how you have such a low number here. What is it you're doing? And they talked a little bit about things the fire department was doing, but the one that really captured my attention was they actually had penalties for people who had false alarms. We did not. Now, many of you probably do this today, but back when we were talking about this in the 90s, it wasn't that common. And so we implemented a program to find people on their third false alarm, and in fact reduced the false alarms from about 1,200 that first year down to 400 the next year, down to less than 200 the year after, and then almost to zero by the fourth year. Because we put classes in place, so if you wanted to avoid a fine, you could go to a false alarm class and learn how to not have false alarms. We got the vendors involved. And the point of the story is it was an efficiency measure. How much time and energy are we spending on these false alarms that caused us to ask that question that led to a solution that increased our efficiency 600 times.
Can you share with us, you had that great slide that showed how many communities, around the U.S. and really around the world you're working with. How many of those does the decision to really amp up strategic planning, does it start with staff versus with the elected officials, or is it usually a combination of both? And how does that kind of balance between what the executive board wants versus what administrative staff wants come into play?
Okay, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? So I find that it's fairly well distributed between the two triggers. Sometimes it's elected officials say, I don't really feel like I understand where we're headed. There's special things that I want to do that nobody's paying attention to. Believe me, that comes up way more than any of us would like, but it's a reality. And lastly, outside pressures. People outside the organization calling the elected officials going, what are you guys doing about X, and why isn't Y been taken care of, and what's going on? And what will happen is the elected officials, because they need to work as a body, will say, well, we need to talk about where we're headed and what we want to accomplish together. That's actually more rare than staff saying, we really don't understand what you want us to do. You're pulling us in 3, 5, 7, 21 different directions, depending on the size of your board. And we need you to make decisions as a corporate body that will direct our behavior so we know what we're trying to accomplish. We don't want to be jerked around all the time. We want to be focused and make things happen. Because most cities have really good staffs that can execute if they know what it is they're trying to execute on. When they don't know, what they do is they stick to the basics. Okay, we've got a fire department, we go put out fires, we save kittens, whatever else we do. And that's all we're going to do. That may not be what the community wants in total from their fire department, but it's what we know, so that's what we do. And we're great at it. When we don't know what the community wants, when we don't know what our elected leaders expect, and we propose this kind of process, what we're doing is we're asking for them to build some sort of consensus around things, which can be a difficult thing to do. I've facilitated many, many meetings, and it astonishes me the diversity of opinion out there, and even the basics that you think everybody would agree is important, not everybody agrees with. So it's an important process of winnowing that down. Kirsten, can you repeat the second half of the question? Make sure I get that right.
Just wondering where typically the decision to kind of make the leap and to make the decision to work with Invisio comes from. Is it typically from that elected level, or is it from the staff level, or is it a combination of both?
So from people wanting to join Invisio, it's really the staff. They want to get their hands around how do we manage this well, and how do we go back to the elected officials and show them what we've done. What happens is when you build your strategic planning process, and I did this so I know it, is you end up saying, well, what do I need? Well, I need a spreadsheet. And you build your spreadsheet. You track your things and you report back on it. Well, you're not going to hand a spreadsheet to the elected officials, so now you write an update report and you say, here's where we are on these different things, here's how the measures are doing, and we're a quarter of the way through the year and we expect it to be here, and here's where we really are. And then you do an annual report. So it used to be called the Service Efforts and Accomplishments Report. Sometimes it's called the State of the City Report, annual report, whatever it's called. Basically, it's a recap of here's where we started out, what we wanted to do, here's what we did along the way, here's what the accomplishments were, and here's where we kind of missed target and what we're going to do to fix that. So whatever you want to call it, it's a report that's generated on an annual basis. And so that's a lot of things to do, and a lot of people are involved in gathering that information and pulling it all together. If you can automate that, if you can figure out ways to do it quickly, easily, if you can have push notifications to remind people to put their parts in there, it saves a lot of time, energy, and heartache along the way. And that's why they come to us. They say, we've got a plan, we need help executing.
Another question about on Twitter about this idea of being pulled in 3, 5, 7 different directions. And obviously kind of the two-sided approach of having the in-house and then the public-facing aspects of reporting and keeping track of your plan addresses that. Any anecdotes or stories that you can share with us about how a strategic plan and a tool like this kind of keeps everyone honest about what are we going to do this year and how are we going to get it done?
So one comment before that is the environmental scan is so critical in that, because when people sit down to do strategic planning, oftentimes it's anecdotal, it's my opinion, it's what I want to do. And that environmental scan gives you raw data, real things to talk about. We're seeing a change in our age demographics. We're going to have more older folks here. That means our services need to change. What are we going to do about that? Versus, it feels like we have more older people. Maybe we should do something. When we first started this in Coral Springs, we rolled it out. We were having at every meeting somebody would say, hey, I went to the Florida League of Cities and I heard about this great initiative that they're doing in Jacksonville. We should do that. Well, it's not, we're in the middle of a budget cycle. We don't really have money. Well, I want you to do it anyway. By the second year we were doing the strategic plan, what the answer is, wow, what a great idea. Let's put that in the hopper for next year. We'll evaluate it against the data we have coming in. We'll prioritize it, determine if it's one of the things we want to do, and shove it in the strategic plan and do it. And you know it'll get done because you'll have our measures and our task list and everything right there to look at. And by the third year, they were saying that to each other. Somebody would come back from a meeting or come back from being out in the community, or they were campaigning and knocking on doors and heard something one day, and the other people on the dais would say, oh, I understand why you're saying that. Let's put that in our strategic plan. And so the next time we did an environmental scan, one of the sections was, here's all the ideas that the commission brought forward during the year. that we need to evaluate. Here's the analysis staff did on that. Could we do it? Do we have the resources? Would it be effective in our community? And how would we do that? Now you can decide, do you actually want to make that one of our strategies? Well, by moving the discussion down the road a little bit and attaching it to resources, sometimes the very people who came up with the idea would say, oh, I didn't know it was going to cost that much, let's not do that. And or, gee, these other things are much more important, let's not do that, let's do these other things. And so it becomes less of chasing the flavor of the month and the most interesting thing, a squirrel, and turns more into how does this fit into our overall approach, and is it something that we should consider?
All right, so I think we have time for one more question, and so I'm going to remind our listeners, please use that message bar over on the left. But I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you prefer annual or biennial budgeting as it relates to strategic planning for local governments?
You know, everything boils down to the comfort level of the organization in using those kind of approaches. Annual is required. I mean, even if you do a biennial budget, you still have to make sure everything is set for the year that's coming up. I always have been more of a fan of long-term financial planning, where you have a 5-year forecast and you look out over the next 5 years as to the impacts that you expect to happen and what that will what that will do to your resources. What raises are you intending to give? What union contracts do you have to uphold? You know, what are all these outside impacts that you have to absorb and do? And then what resources are available to make changes along the way? So if you have a 5-year forecast, that's renewing every year as well, because anything that you project into the future is malleable and will change over time. But you're starting to think in advance, well, if we make this decision and then this happens, we're going to have a big problem. So let's not make that decision or make it differently. And it gives a context for making some decisions that have long-term impacts, especially in the capital program area that was missing before. So if you say, hey, in 2 years I want to build a community center, well, I can tell you in 3 years what the electricity is going to cost and how much staffing you have to put in there and what the insurance is going to be and what the total impact of that is. A biennial budget really is just that same thing. We're going to adopt a budget for 2 years all at once, predict what those things are in the following year, and make sure that we address at the change in the year any changes that have been made. It really is just taking that next year in the forecast and making it live. So as long as you're looking into the future, I think you're fine. It doesn't matter if you're on a single year or a biennial.
All right, and our last question is about scalability. Does Invisio have any lessons in scalability? Is there a too small community that you found? Any thoughts on that?
No, not at all. The plan itself, the complexity of the plan is what makes it viable or not. If you have only 2 levels, we have a mission and some goals, then our software really is not going to help you because there's nothing to track. There's no measures, there's no actions, there's no updates to give. We've got communities with as small as 4,000 people and to very large hundreds of thousands of people communities. So it really has nothing to do with the scale of the community, but rather the complexity of the plan and how you're implementing it.
All right, so we have come to the end of today's webinar, and I want to thank you, Kevin, for a great presentation. Thank you to all of our attendees and for sharing your time with us as well. And as a reminder, we have recorded today's webinar, and we will have it available online soon at elgl.org. You can reference the hashtag ELGLJam on Twitter to review and share your thoughts from today's discussion. Please stay in touch with Kevin online, and we'll also include his contact information on the recording and blog post from the webinar. And so with that, I'm going to end the webinar today. Thanks everyone for your support of ELGL.
Thank you.